Thank you very much. Now, we can open to the Q&A.
Hi, so lovely to meet you, and thank you so much for your very interesting talk. I'm Valentina, I'm a curator. I used to be based in Korea, now I'm based around the world, let's say. And I also worked in art and science a lot. So it's so interesting to hear from a fellow practitioner in art and science. And I'm just very curious in the latest development of your work using AI, because as you said, like there's like a lot of environmental impact in AI, and now you're working especially in the development of a data center. And I mean, your work will look at this development of the data center in Korea, assessing it critically, I imagine. But you're also building your own AI models for your work. And every AI model has an environmental impact. So how do you engage with something that also you stand critically against, let's say, or like that you engage critically in a sense, and how do you use it at the same time? Because even if it's like house-made, let's say, you still have to use hardware that then will have an impact, whether it's like data storage, etc. And yeah, all of that. So I was just very interested to know how you engage with that.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. Yeah, so I mean, this is part of a broader question as well, of the environmental impact of artistic practice, right? And it's something that I haven't talked about in this talk, but is a very strong part of my practice. And I'm constantly sort of assessing what the environmental impacts of my work are. And for instance, How to Touch a Dragonfly is designed to be labor intensive, but completely modular and have a low environmental cost for shipping, for instance, and have everything reusable. When it came to the development of the AI for Not Breaking This Wave Drowns Hate, this was really the central question, in fact, that drove the idea of the project, was to ask whether there are creative ways that AI can be used to create a benefit that counterbalances this environmental impact. And I stand still extremely critically on that side, right? So there was a UN study of the environmental impacts of AI, and it was released just prior to the start of that research for Not Breaking This Wave Drowns Hate. And the conclusion essentially was that any environmental benefits have not been proven, and there is not data enough for it, but the environmental damage has been significantly accounted for, right? So, and studied. And so I would say at the moment, I don't think that there, even with my incredible artwork, I don't think that there is enough positive impact from AI to argue that the environmental repercussions are warranted. So in the new work, Thirst for Knowledge, one of the things that makes this data center that would be built in Jeollanam-do interesting is that it would be entirely solar powered, or in accounting purposes, entirely solar powered. And there's talk of it using about 60% less water for cooling. Now, one can argue, and I'm in the middle of the research, so I'm not going to make any conclusions, right? But one could argue that if there's no environmental benefit from deploying the AI, even if it's slightly more sustainable than every other data center, it could arguably not be worth it. But I'm open to finding out more, right? Which is the approach that I apply to all of my artistic research.
Thank you so much.
So I want to make sure I understand what you said about dragonflies. because early in July, maybe the first or second week, I was walking along the Han River. And that day, I don't know why, I hadn't noticed this any other time I'd walked down the Han River. There were millions and millions of dragonflies. Just, it was stunning. I tried to take a video of it, but it doesn't capture the experience of seeing that many dragonflies. And I also thought it was interesting how they all tended to fly right above my head. So you would think you're walking and getting smashed in the face, but no, they all kind of hover. It was very surreal. And I'm curious, I had that in mind, talking about the relationship between the dragonflies to their environment. And you said something about this sort of paradox where if if nature is sort of evolving in a way that is beneficial to humans, then it is not for dragonflies. I just want to make sure if you could go over that one more time.
Sure,
Thank
sure. It's interesting that you mentioned the swarm, because that's Aesenogalesis normally in Seoul, which is a type of dragonfly that didn't used to make it this far north. But because things are getting hotter up the peninsula, you get that dragonfly now swarming. Thank you for asking for clarification, because maybe I didn't explain it clearly enough. So the concept is that normally, in terms of research, dragonflies are used, like they're studied as an indicator of the health of the environment in general. And the health of the environment in general means, let's say, having like a nice, biodiverse, healthy system that's resilient. But that's not necessarily necessary for humans, but they're often an indicator of things like pollution, which are important for human health as well. But the point is that the dragonflies are being studied for the interests of the humans, right? And the impact of human behavior is what's affecting their environment. And that's the reasons that the humans are studying them. And what I wanted to do with How to Touch a Dragonfly was to shift the perspective to the experience of the dragonfly, and to look at things like dragonfly migration, which is happening. We call it dragonfly migration, right? But what it is dragonflies are less able to survive in one place and more able to survive in a new place. Or sometimes there is no new place for them. So there's a dragonfly called Nanophyia coreana, which is about this big, like 1 centimeter long. It's extremely rare. It's a Korean cousin of a more prevalent Nanophyia that is in most of the Asian region. And it was identified as its own dragonfly species in 2020. And as soon as it was identified as its own species, it was realized that it was super rare and endangered, because it likes to live preferably in rice fields that have been left fallow for 1 year. So there's not a lot, and in the mountains. And so there's not a lot of places that it wants to live. And it's becoming more endangered as farming practices are changing and as the climate is changing. And I read about this and I was thinking about, the landscape from the perspective of that dragonfly, becomes less and less livable. And I wanted to see then what the world feels like for the dragonfly, instead of thinking about it as a tool by which we can, for ourselves, understand what's happening to the environment. What does it look like if your home is slowly diminishing around you? So So I wanted to make How to Touch a Dragonfly to be this like incredibly beautiful installation that in the end has something that's kind of quite melancholic at its core, and that's which is something that I do in a lot of the works. Is that
Yes, thank you. And it's interesting because you were talking about how this work can sort of place you literally in the perspective of a dragonfly, minus a few pixels, of course. But it goes back to the beginning where you're talking about creating empathy. I find it to be very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Please.
I was trying to kind of put several things together, and I was wondering whether you're looking at data centers from a more than human point of view, so the impact on not just so taking water from humans and so on, but also whether it has an impact on dragonflies or other animals on that as well.
Yes, thank you for the question. Yes, that is the approach that I'm taking. So when I look at landscape, I'm going to be making field recordings and video documentation within the landscape where the development would happen, and using that as a kind of example landscape, let's say, for data center development worldwide. And I will be looking at that landscape as an ecosystem in its entirety when I make those researches and recordings. So indeed, looking at things like how I'm looking at water specifically, so how changes to the water might be impacting, let's say, what that landscape and coastal environment are going to look like. Yeah, thank you.
I'm Christina. I'm an illustrator, and I wanted to revisit a little bit of someone. You said something about empathy in your work and trying to invite people to have more empathy. And during your presentation, I was very touched because at some point, maybe I picked up the wrong thing, but maybe you almost started to cry a little bit. So I was touched about your passion, and I guess that developed very early on. And I am from Romania. I am born to be very desensitized about environmental issues. We don't even practice recycling, or we are not mindful in general, of course, of our consumption. And was there any moment in your development as a human being and artist as well that you had to retrain yourself or a little bit force yourself to look more deeply into environmental issues, or did it come naturally to you?
Thank you for the question, and for noticing how passionate I am. Yes. Let's see. In answer to your question, I would say it's a constantly evolving thing, right? Because the world changes and one has to assess how to respond. But I would say that the kind of core values about what should be the priority and what I think is right I've been constantly interrogating them, but mostly reaffirming them as I've gone through. And they, those core values are what directed my decision to leave academia for a start, right? And go into it in the first place. And like with these questions about kind of the environmental impact of my practice, I'm constantly kind of trying to assess what's the right thing to do. There was one thing which I still find extremely hard, which is I was vegetarian from the age of 9, and at one point I was having a lot of health problems, and the doctor said, "Okay, you eat fish now, or you're going to die early." And I was like, okay. And that was really, really hard for me. And I decided that I would try to make a balance, right? And this was a very big shift in my thinking, because I had previously always tried to minimize my impact on the world. And I thought, no, actually, maybe I'm thinking about this wrong, because we can't have no impact. Otherwise, we wouldn't exist. So what I should be trying to do is to make sure that I have a net positive impact for the things that I think are important, right? And I would say that this was a very valuable response to something that was extremely challenging for me as a person. Yeah, that's probably the biggest one.
Thank you so much.
Back to Valentina.
Thank you. I just had a thought about this follow-up question following what everyone was saying, which is more about our relationships as art practitioner or as creator artists to our audience, especially when it comes to environmental conversation or whatever scientific conversation you may want to bring into like an exhibition. So one of the big questions, I think, like when we create exhibitions is like, how can we communicate to the widest audience possible, right? And it has been in general like a big problem of the arts and contemporary art, like how do you touch a certain audience, how do you widen your audience, etc., etc. And science itself, especially the complexity of science itself today, it's already difficult to share with the general public. And so more and more like arts has become a tool used by like different institutions. I used to work at CERN in the residency program, and like we used to do that. And assessments were good and bad on like how actually we were managing to do that. And so as an artist, like I was wondering how you, as an artist and a scientist, because you started with academia, which is like the most elitist place in the world in many, many aspects, and especially when it comes to communication to the general public, what are your strategies and thoughts when you set up an exhibition to like reach the broadest audience possible, how to make it accessible? Whereas like, let's say like a kid comes in, like how do you engage with them, like, or like someone that has no knowledge or background knowledge about what you're talking about, how do you, and also how do you maybe this is something I've been trying a lot in my exhibition, is like to bring that evocative element into it that like speaks to the soul first, and then little by little engage more into like the more academic part or like the more like serious stuff. Yeah, just wanted to know like how do you approach that?
This is a super complicated area, right? Because also I'm not a fan of arts being instrumentalized. For my own work, I tend to try to keep this like vast amount of research out of sight when it comes to the exhibition itself, so that the first thing that is encountered is the feeling evoked by the exhibition. And that's strategic because I make works that try to speak to kind of creating empathy or feeling like emotional responses to topics relating to the environment. And then so when I make the artworks, I try to make them clear enough to lead towards the topic, but without being didactic, right? And I'm very clear also, because this is also an ethical question when working with people's voices and participatory materials, right? That this is always my interpretation after having synthesized the learning from other people and from landscapes of the topic in question. On top of that, I do things like training the volunteers with kind of specific points that will make the artwork more understood, but as an artwork and as a piece of artistic research, not as a conveyance of other people's research, let's say. And I write papers about the artworks too, right? And I do a lot of interviews about the artworks so that the kind of background can be communicated, but it's not forefront in an exhibition context normally. Yeah. Yes, I think this is also something that I assess in an ongoing manner. And my decision for me is that this is the thing that I'm best at. And so this is how I should be spending my time. And I try my best to amplify its impact and do the best that I can for with these works. I also write policy documents and work with policymakers, looking at both the intersection of artistic research and scientific research and policy, that kind of thing, and write recommendations and I involve, because there are different ways that you can engage strategically with policy, right, as you know, and so I also try to involve policymakers, if appropriate, in the participatory research for the works, so that there's a more active engagement. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Ariel. Thanks, Kat, for sharing. I'm just really curious for the work of This Land Is Not Mine. When you work with the locals, what are their responses? Do they share the same sentiment, same brief, or do you gain any insights from them? Yeah, in those projects that you've done.
For all of the projects, or
This land, well, maybe just for one.
the Arctic one, or the yeah, that one, yeah. It was that was a really interesting learning experience. Actually, that was because one thread that came through when talking to people in the Arctic was the importance of food and food practices to landscape identity, and the complexation of extractivist methods, so mining and the impact of mining and the kind of socioeconomic factors that then impact on food practices in the region. And this was something that I wouldn't have been able to predict from, and I did a lot of research up front with the Scott Polar Research Institute to find out more about the region before I went. But that was something really interesting. And there's a lot of activism in the region to try to do things like preserving like ice routes. So in the winter, when the ice freezes, there's new routes that you can go through because you can go across the ice. It's thick enough. You can go from land to land,
This
right?
is a bit hard for me to imagine coming from. I come from Singapore, so this
yeah,
thanks
very different climate. Obviously, when the summer comes and the ice breaks up, that you have to go by boat, right? But you can go by sledge in between. And there was, at the time when I was there in 2017, there were legal battles going on to try to stop a mine that was situated to the north of the kind of Nunavut region from shipping during the winter months, because it would break the ice and stop the hunters from the towns going out to hunt for food, which is the main source of food in the region. If that hunting route doesn't exist, then people become reliant on imported foods, which affects not only financial and socioeconomic things, but also health, because the diet in the region is suitable for the climatic conditions of the region and people are used to it. And when they started to eat imported food, they told me it comes with health impacts, negative health impacts.
That's really interesting to know. Thank you.
Hi, I've got a
more generic questions about the way you work and your approach. Like in your daily practice, is it more you have an idea of your ultimate performance or installation, and then that drives the research and the field trip? Or is it, do you start from like the research, or there is a scientific idea you want to dig deeper and that leads to the art? Like how do you approach this relationship?
It depends a little bit on the project, but for the kind of works that I've been showing here, they're all like larger works with a lot more research basis, and they come. It's hard to say what comes first, but I have a question. I have something that's bothering me, essentially. Sometimes I don't know specifically what it is that's bothering me, but it's something that I'm concerned about in the world. And I start to search around, right? And not always consciously. And I'll click on something in my mind, like something will click, and I'll be like, that's the thing, that's really interesting. That's the thing I want to look at. And I'll start to just kind of poodle around that question for a bit. And then normally, a lot of these projects are funded projects, right? So I apply for funding and realize the projects. And so what I'll do is I'll have this idea in mind of something that I want to do. And I'll be making smaller non-funded works and compositions and doing bits and bobs of research until I see a funding call where it fits. And then I start really going deep into the topic. And normally the exact shape of the work comes in the process of consolidating what I already know and what I'm learning into something that fits to what I've learnt so far in the research. So for instance, with This Land Is Not Mine, initially I thought I was going to make a sound and video work, but I decided in the end to go for this 20 channels because of the outcome of the research that showed that it needed to be this fragmented, multifaceted view on the region that was the kind of correct way to portray it according to my own experience. For instance, The Matter of the Soul, I intended to make a haptic, the Arctic one, I intended to make a haptic installation. And I went to the region and did all the research and was like, oh, no, this is sound. This is sound. And then it needs to be sculpture with this motif. The motif had to be there because that's the shape that you see in the landscape. And it's the shape of the water carving through from the glaciers on its like joyful approach to the sea. And when you're in the Arctic, everything's kind of blue and grey until you see blood from the hunt. And then it's like streaks of red across this blue and grey, and it's really arresting when you're there. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, so if you don't have any other questions, I can say it. Class dismissed. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Super. Thank you very much.